Moment. Let I close this one. Where is it?
Now we
Disable?
can see your screen, full screen.
Yeah,
It's
it's
okay.
fine.
Yeah, I would like only to leave this this pop-up here, but I don't know how to do that. Maybe yes, this one? No? Okay. Oh, yes. Okay, are you able to see my screen in presentation mode, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Matteo. I'm working with Antonio and Mirko in engineering since 2021. And today with this presentation, I would like to talk to you about NGSI-LD and in particular NGSI-LD context broker. This session is split into two parts. In the first part, we will see NGSI-LD from a more theoretical point of view. So by using this presentation, we will talk about the main features of a NGSI-LD context broker. And then after that, we will do a short demo by using a context broker, an NGSI-LD context broker that is, in our case, Orion LD from Fireware. So this is the agenda. First of all, we need to talk about JSON-LD because NGSI-LD is based on JSON-LD. In particular, NGSI-LD, as we will see, uses JSON-LD as a data exchange data format. But this is not the main goal of this presentation. So we will use a couple of slides to talk about JSON-LD. So JSON-LD is more than that, but we will do a short introduction to this data format in order then to understand why JSON-LD is better than other standard or other data format, let's say. So after that, we will talk about the history and evolution of NGSI. We will start from NGSI version 1 to NGSI version 3, that is NGSI-LD. Then we will talk about the main features of an NGSI-LD entity that are NGSI-LD entity, tenant and scope, and attributes and sub-attributes. These are very, very important concepts into NGSI-LD standard. Then we will talk about the different payload format of JSON-LD into the context of the NGSI-LD. Then we will see the context attribute in this data that plays a crucial role into the JSON-LD in this case. Then we will see the API exposed by NGSI-LD context broker, so the CRUD operations, and also with respect to the GET operation, so the read operation, we will see a very, very powerful feature exposed by NGSI-LD context broker, that is the query language. We will see that we can use query language in order to filter the data and get only the data that are relevant for our system. Then after that, we will see another important topic of NGSI-LD context broker, that is subscriptions. Remember that we are talking about a broker, so we have the publish subscribe mechanism, and we will see how to subscribe to a topic in the context of NGSI-LD. Finally, we will see also the main difference between NGSI-LD and NGSI version 2. And then I will try to leave 10 minutes at the end of this presentation in order to answer to your questions or doubts. So let's start with JSON-LD. JSON is not an interoperable data format. It means that if we have 2 or more systems that are able to talk JSON, the systems are not interoperable. And in order to understand why that, let's do an example. If you have a JSON, you know that is a key values parameters, right? If one of these key is name, and as value of this key we have John, for me, the name key is the native name of a person. For Mirko, the name key is the, I don't know, the artist name of a person. For Antonio, the attribute name is the username of a person in order to log it in into the system. So which is the real meaning of this attribute name? We don't know. We need to ask to the one that generates this JSON. That's why JSON is not so interoperable. We need to add context to the data. We need to add the meaning of the data in order to understand, okay, this attribute name has this meaning or means the native name of a person. And in order to do that, we need to use JSON-LD. JSON-LD is an extension of JSON. Now, with JSON-LD, we don't have only key value parameter, as in the JSON, but we have dictionary value parameter. The key is not only a string now, but is a JSON that points to the context of this key, that describes this key. For example, in the name, we can have, okay, this is the native name of the person. This is mandatory. So you will not find a JSON without the name key because it's mandatory. Or it has a max length, for example. We add context to the attribute name in order to don't have only a key value parameter, but a dictionary value parameter. That is very, very important because now we are able to understand the meaning of this attribute name, and the people are able to understand the meaning, and also the machine are able, also the computer are able to understand the meaning of this attribute name. That's why JSON-LD is more interoperable with respect to the JSON. We add context to the data by using JSON-LD. Let's do an example in order to understand better this very, very important concept of JSON-LD. For example, in this case, on the right, you can see that we have a JSON-LD. This is a JSON that refers to an entity that is a book here. We have the name in this JSON that is example book. But now I am asking myself, which is the meaning of this attribute name? Is the name of the book? Is the name of the author of the book? Which is the meaning? I can open the context of this book. You see here, we have these attributes that are a context for this JSON. It is a URI, a URL in this case, that point to another JSON that is the context of this data. In this other JSON, we have the list of attributes that we can find in this JSON, and we can search for the name in order to see, okay, this is the description, for example, the name of the book, and this is the expected type. For example, in this case, is a TXT, but we can have more details about the key. For example, as I said before, the max length, if this field is mandatory or not, and so on. And you can see here that in a single JSON-LD, we can have multiple contexts. You see here that we have this URL that is a context, but also we have this other URL that is again a context. And why we have multiple contexts? Because we have, again, the attribute name here, but in this case, this attribute name is under the author. So it has a different meaning with respect to the name of the book. And which is the meaning of this attribute name? In this case, John Doe, but this name could be name and surname of the author of the book, or could be name, first name and second name of the author of the book. In order to understand that, I can open this URL that points again to another JSON, another context JSON for this data, search for name and see, okay, this is the first name and this is the second name of the author of the book, and so on. And you can see, and you can see here that we have different contexts. We have a context for the attribute description that is here, which is the meaning of this attribute description. I can open this description and see, okay, the description means that, and it is a string, the max length is tot, and so on. So in this case, I am able not only to understand the meaning of each attribute, but also the different meanings of the attributes, because the name for the book is different with respect to the name for the author. Who know Java, this concept is very, very easy. For example, in this case, you see that we have the person context here, okay, with the name. Now, the name is the, I don't know, the first name and surname of the person. But A person can be, I don't know, a policeman. And you know that in Java, the class policeman extend the class person. And we add more context to the attributes from the class person and also maybe more attributes. So it works in the same way. We can have multiple contexts for the same attribute because the same attribute in different contexts, in different entities, can have multiple meanings. And that's why JSON-LD is very, very powerful because now we know which is the meaning of each attribute in the JSON-LD. So this is a short introduction to the JSON-LD just to understand why NGSI-LD standard is interoperable, is an interoperable standard. But JSON-LD is more than that. So this is not the purpose, but this is the key feature of JSON-LD and why JSON-LD is a standard, is a data form, interoperable data format. So after this introduction to JSON-LD, let's start with NGSI-LD. First of all, NGSI-LD means Next Generation Service Interface Linked Data, and is an open standard. Pay attention that is a standard. So this is very important because we have the views and we have also the way to evaluate if a system is compliant with the NGSI-LD. And if we know that the system is compliant with the standard NGSI-LD, I can create a system that is interoperable with this system without know the code, for example, the API and so on, because all these things are described in the standard. So NGSI-LD is a standard for context information management and also to exchange data information between applications in the context of Internet of Things, but not only Internet of Things. And you can see on bottom of these slides, the entities that currently are using NGSI. And you see here, of course, we have Fiverr in 300 Fiverr smart cities, over the globe. And this is because Fiverr also is one of the foundation of NGSI. But NGSI is used also by Amazon Web Service in a service that is called the Smart Territory Framework. It is used also by UDIX in 35 smart cities, but also by other partners, by other Fiverr partners, for example, Red Hat, Telefonica, and so on. So you know here that NGSI is very, very popular, especially in the world of smart city. This is the history. NGSI born in 2012 with Open Mobile Alliance that published the version 1 of NGSI. In the same year, Fiverr that born as an European project starts with the conviction of using NGSI. In 2014, Telefonica, that is a partner from Fiverr, defines NGSI version 2, that is an evolution of NGSI. And then in 2017, ETSI, that is a standardization company, will define as standard NGSI version 3, that is what we call now NGSI-LD. And in 2018, the Connecting Europe facility select Orion and Orion LD to be one of the 5 of its principal building blocks from a TSI, preferred standard by European Commission. So you see here that in 6 years, the NGSI becomes a very, very popular framework, a very, very popular standard. But which is the difference? We know now that NGSI-LD is the evolution of NGSI version 2. But which are the features, the most important features added in this context, in this NGSI-LD? First of all, the ID. Now the ID must be a URL that could be a URI or an HTTP URL and so on. And this is very important because the ID now is not a simple string or a simple number, but is a URL that uniquely identify the entity that we are describing with that JSON-LD. Then we must to have the type into the JSON. With NGSI-LD, we must have the type that is the entity type that this JSON-LD is describing. Then we need to have the context. As I said before, NGSI-LD is based on JSON-LD. And for that, in JSON-LD, we must have in the data the context. If we don't send the context to the context broker, for example, to the API of the context broker, then automatically the context broker takes as default this context. If I open this context here, you see that there are the most common attributes in the data. For example, in the data, you have frequently have, for example, the date observed or the location. And for that, the default context of NGSI-LD context broker defines the type of this entity. We will find here the location, for example, describing that the location is a GeoJSON. We can find here the date observed, describing that the date observed must be in UTC format, for example, with respect to this time zone and so on. So if we don't send a customized context to the context broker, to NGSI-LD context broker, then NGSI-LD context broker will take as default its context broker, this context broker. So this is the role of the context attribute that is very important in the JSON-LD, and in particular in NGSI-LD standard. So now NGSI-LD is based on the entity concept. The entity is composed by an ID, as we said before. The entity must have an ID, and the ID must be a URL. Then we have the type, that is the type of the entity, the scope, and the tenant. We will see now which is the meaning of each of these attributes, let's say, of the entity. Starting from the tenant, NGSI-LD context broker is a multi-tenant context broker. It means that we can use the same NGSI-LD context broker to serve multiple pilots, for example, or multiple users. In this case, based on a parameters that we will send as either parameter to the NGSI-LD context broker, that is this either parameter, we can tell to the context broker, okay, please store this data, store this entity, create this entity for this tenant. And the NGSI-LD context broker read the tenant and create the entity in the corresponding database. We have a database for each tenant in a NGSI-LD context broker, multi-tenant. That's why we have a multi-tenant context broker. And important is that the data are isolated. These database are isolated. We can have a database in a region, another database in another region, and we can have a distributed, let's say, database. And the data are isolated. What I have here, for example, is not correlated with what I have here. And this is important because, for example, we can integrate Orion context broker, sorry, an NGSI-LD context broker with Keycloak in order to say, okay, if only the users within a specific organization can access to this tenant, and only the user within this other organization can access to this other tenant. And we can add this security level to an NGSI-LD context broker. That's why the tenant is very, very important. And as I said, we can select a database with these either parameters. Then context broker will create this database based on the tenant parameter, or will update if the database already exists. Then we have the scope. The scope is another either parameter that we can use in the API of NGSI-LD context broker to give an hierarchical structure to the data. You know that we are talking about NGSI-LD context broker. So we have a broker. And let's say that we have multiple IoT sensors in the Europe, okay? We have sensors in Italy, in this country. We have sensors in Spain, in Greece, and so on. Now, I would like to subscribe only to the sensors that are located, I don't know, in Lecce here. In order to do that, I can use the scope. I can create a new subscription. We will see how to do that later. And then I can say, okay, I would like to subscribe to all changes in the IoT sensors, but only for the sensors that are placed in lecture. And I can do that by using the scope. In particular, as either parameter, I can send this scope to the NGSI-LD context broker that say, I would like to be subscribed to the sensor that are located in lecture. And with this wildcard here, we can have multiple options. It means that in all countries within lecture, in this case, Gallipoli and Otranto. This means that I will receive notification when an IoT data will change only within Gallipoli or Otranto or Lecce. And this is the main goal of NGSI-LD scope. This is not valid only for subscription. This is valid only also for the get entities, for example. If you use the API exposed by a context broker to get the device that are placed in Lecce, we can use scope to filter these devices in order to have only the devices that are within this country. And we can do that by using NGSI-LD scope. And that's the NGSI-LD scope or NGSI-LD context broker. Then we have, as I said, the entity type. The entity type is the type of the entity described by a specific JSON. And why this is important? Because based on the entity type, we can have predefined attributes. For example, if I have an entity type car, I expect to have in the attribute, the attribute speed, or the attribute location, or the attribute, I don't know, fuel level. So we can have multiple attributes related to that specific entity type, to the entity type car. So plays a crucial role in the data semantics, the entity type. If you search for a smart data models, for a firewall smart data models that are data compliant with the NGSI and the NGSI-LD, in fact, if you open the GitHub repository, they have the NGSI data format for a smart data model, but also the JSON-LD data format. And if you open the JSON-LD, you will see that the type is a string that identifies that specific smart data model. And also that ID is a URN and so on. So that's why the entity type is very, very important, because by reading the type of the entity, we can know which attributes this entity will have in the body. This is the entity type. For who develop, for example, SQL table, the entity type is the name of the table. And the attribute of the table, the columns of the table, are the attribute in the JSON with that specific entity type. Okay, then we have the NGSI-LD entity ID. This is another important key in the JSON. In a JSON-LD and in the context of NGSI-LD, in the JSON, you must have the ID. And the ID must be a URI. That could be a URN or a URL. In this case, in the most common case, you will find an ID in this format. You see, this is the URN of the entity, the ID of the entity. And we have the entity type. In this case, for example, in this example is car, and the entity ID that could be a number that uniquely identify the car, and a specific car. So this is the ID. We will try that if we try to create an entity in a NGSI-LD context broker with an ID that is not a URI, we will have an error from NGSI-LD context broker, and we will see that. But pay attention that the entity ID is not the unique identifier of an entity, because we need to consider the tenant. As I said before, NGSI-LD context broker is a multi-tenant context broker. It means that in two different tenants, we can have the entity ID, two entities, sorry, with the same ID. That's why the entity ID is not the unique identifier of an entity, but the combination of entity ID and the tenant, so the database, is the unique identifier of an entity. We call it total identifier of an entity, the set of ID and tenant. That's why you find here marked these two values. Then we need to extend the meaning of the entity in NGSI-LD context broker, because an entity, we know that an entity has the ID, has the type, but has only attributes. And an entity can have one or multiple attributes. The attributes, in simple words, are the key that we can find, are the attributes of the JSON that we can find in the JSON of the entity. And each attribute is described by a type, a name, and a value. The type is the type of the attribute. And as we can see here, NGSI-LD context broker support different types of attribute. A property, if this is a simple property for an entity, a geoproperty. If a specific attribute is, for example, a location, a GeoJSON, this is a geoproperty. Or a temporal property. If we have a date time, for example, or a date, we have an attribute that is a temporal property type. The language property and so on, we can have different types of property and are listed here. Then we have the name, refers to the field, of course. For example, in the example of car entity, one attribute was speed. The speed is a property, so type property, name speed. Value is the actual information of this attribute. Pay attention that NGSI-LD context broker is not able to store historical data. If we ask for an entity, for the entity car, for example, let's say for my car, if I'm asking from my car to get the information about my car, I will be able to see only the last values, the most updated values of my entity. For example, speed, the last speed of my car. We are not able to get the historical data of the speed yesterday, for example. And that's why we need additional fireware components to store the data from NGSI-LD context broker. But this is to say that NGSI-LD context broker is a broker. The goal of a broker is to dispatch data among all the components, is not to store the data. And that's why in the attribute, when we have the value of an attribute, we talk about the actual information associated with the specific attribute. That's the meaning of the entity attributes. And then we can have again a sub-attribute. So the entity can have one or more attribute, and an attribute can have one or more sub-attribute. In this case, for example, we can have the unit code. For example, the speed is an attribute, okay? The attribute speed has one sub-attribute that is the unit code, kilometers per hour, for example. Or observed at. We know that the attribute speed is the last speed of my car. And when it was observed, then I can read this sub-attribute observed at in order to get the actual date. So the final picture is this one. In NGSI-LD context broker, we have the entity. An entity can have one or multiple attributes, and attribute can have one or multiple sub-attributes. The attribute and sub-attribute are described by type, name, and value, as we said before. And the entity is described by an ID that is mandatory, also type is mandatory, and tenant and scope. The tenant is the database on which the entity is stored, and the scope is to create the hierarchical structure for the data. That is the final picture. Then, on top of this entity attribute and sub-attribute, we have the API of NGSI-LD context broker in order to access the data. Before to see the API, let's see the different payloads format. So when we talk with an NGSI-LD context broker, we can use different format of JSON-LD. These three here are JSON-LD, but in this case, we have the normalized format. And the difference is the attribute. You see here, in this case, we have the attribute with the type value and also the sub-attribute unit, and also the sub-attribute unit code. The same for brand, we have type and value. The brand attribute in this case hasn't sub-attribute. We can visualize this JSON also in this other data format called sys. And you can see what we lose here is the type of the property. You see, we have speed, value, and unit code without the type that we have here. And the same for brand. In this case, we have type and value. Here, we lose the type attribute, and we have directly the value. Then, in the simplified data format, we lose the sub-attribute of the attributes. In this case, you see, we have speed, we have brand, but we don't have the unit code of the speed. And this is why the normalized data format is more interoperable, because if I have a JSON with the speed 19, I don't know which is the unit code of this speed. But if I have the normalized JSON, I know that this speed is in kilometers per hour. So we, in the JSON and NGSI-LD context broker, we can use all of these data formats, but keep in mind that the normalized one are the most interoperable, sorry. Then I go fast here because we already talked about the context. The context field in NGSI-LD is used to define the semantic context of data. We talked before about JSON-LD. NGSI-LD is using JSON-LD, and then we have the context into NGSI-LD data. And by default, we have the context that I showed before, but we can define a customized context. For example, if you would like to build your JSON, your data model, let's say, you can create your context in order to say, I have this field that is the name of a person, the name of a book, and so on. So we can define our context, but important is that when we talk with the NGSI-LD context broker, we must have context in the data. Otherwise, we have error from NGSI-LD context broker. We cannot speak with an NGSI-LD context broker. And again, this is an example, is more or less the same, but in this case, we have a JSON-LD that is an entity of type temperature sensor. You see here, type temperature sensor. The ID that is a URI, in this case, in the same format that I showed before, entity type and ID, unique ID of this entity. Then we have the temperature that is an attribute for this entity. But okay, in this case is easier, right? Because we know that the temperature is a measure from this temperature sensor. But in some case could be difficult. And that's why we have the context. If I open this context, in particular refer to the temperature attribute, I can read, okay, the temperature is a measurement made by this sensor. And we can have also a value and the unit code here. That is the sub-attribute of this attribute temperature. You see here that in this case, we have the normalized data format because we have attribute, type of the attribute, and sub-attribute of the attribute. We have in the first case, the most interoperable one. On top of these entities, attributes and sub-attributes, NGSI-LD context broker exposes some API in order to interact with the data. And these APIs are regarding the CRUD operations that we can do on the entities. The create, the read, update, and delete. This is the base URL that we need to use in order to interact with an NGSI-LD context broker. You see here that we have NGSI-LD/version1. And this is some APIs that we can use, for example, to create an entities or to update an entities, a specific entity, an entity ID, or to read entities or to filter entities in order to get only the entities that, for example, have the temperature greater than a threshold. So we have different APIs exposed by NGSI-LD context broker. And one of the most important API is the querying API. Because by using a JSON-LD context broker, we can filter the entities, we can get the entities filtered by a specific attribute. For example, filtered by ID in this case, or by type, or we can use query language. Very, very important. We will see an example of this. We can say, okay, get me the entities that have the attribute temperature, and the attribute temperature must have greater than, I don't know, 20. In this case, NGSI-LD context broker will return to you only the entities with a temperature greater than 20. GeoQuery. We can also GeoQuery the NGSI-LD context broker, and also different other filters method that we have by using the NGSI-LD context broker API. This is an example of query language. As I said before, this is very, very powerful because we can use different operators here. For example, in this case, we check the existence of an attribute. In this case, we ask the NGSI context broker to return the entities that have this attribute in the JSON. In this case, the entities that don't have this attribute in the JSON. In this case, the entity that have this attribute, the A attribute in the JSON, and the A attribute is equal to 7, or is equal to 7, 13, or 23, or is in the 723 range. And we have different query language operators that we can use when we interact with NGSI-LD context broker. Also here you see the example that I do before. In this case, when the observed at property is greater than 2023. In this case, less than 23.4, and so on. We can filter the data, the entities. But also the query language. In this case, if I have an entities with a location that is a point, for example, we can get all the entities within a place, within a zone, by using the GeoQuery. In this case, for example, I would like to get the entities that are near to this point with a distance of 100 kilometers here. No, sorry, meters maybe. I need to check. But in any case, in this case, I can filter by using GeoQuery operators. And we can do that by using the get API. In this case, you see we have the query in the as query parameters of this API, or by using a post. And in this case, we have a JSON in order to get to filter this data. The last important concept of an NGSI context broker, last but not least, of course, because maybe this is the most important feature for an NGSI-LD context broker, is the subscription. With the subscription, I can ask for the context broker to be notified if the attribute of an entities change. For example, in this case, I ask to the NGSI-LD context broker, please notify me if the temperature attribute of an entity, so all the entities that have the temperature attribute in the data, is equal to 20. And when this happens, for example, when I update an entities by changing the temperature value to 20, then NGSI-LD context broker will notify the subscribed clients. For example, you see here, this is the DSS subscribed for temperature greater than 15. I send an update to the entity with temperature equal to 20, and then NGSI-LD context broker notify this client, but not this one, because this one would like to be notified if the temperature is equal to 23. This one, yes, because it would like to be notified if the temperature is less than 14, and in this case, 20 is less than 14. So this is the mechanism, and in NGSI-LD context broker is able to notify the subscribed clients by using HTTP, but also MQTT protocol. You see here MQTT, and this one is an HTTP. So I create the subscription before, and then when the condition happens, NGSI-LD context broker will send to me a notification. This is the concept of subscriptions. And the subscriptions is characterized by the watched attributes and conditions. As I said before, we need to specify a condition. In the case before was temperature less than 23. This is the condition. I would like to be notified if the temperature is less than a threshold or greater than a threshold, or whatever you want. Then the entities. Okay, but which, because the temperature is an attribute that could be part for multiple entities. We can have, I don't know, a device that has the attribute temperature, but also the weather observed entity that has that attribute temperature. And we can filter, I would like to be notified only for weather observed entity, for example. And that's why we have entities. And then notification. Okay, you create your subscription, but how you would like to be notified? HTTP, okay, which is the URL of this HTTP endpoint. And that's why when we create a subscription with this URL, we need to specify, as I said, the entity's type, in this case, filling level sensor, the watched attributes. Okay, I would like to watch filling, and I would like to be notified, you see here, when filling is greater than 0.6, or filling is less than 0.8, or controlled asset is equal to that ID. No, sorry, maybe it's end condition here. Sorry, I'm wrong. This is end. So filling greater than 0.6 and filling less than 0.8, and controlled asset, that is another attribute of this entity type, is equal to this string. This is the part of notification. Okay, I would like to be notified by using HTTP. You see here, Yuri with my URL in application JSON, of course, this is the target. And I can specify also the format, normalized, key values, as we said before. We can specify the formats. And in this case, NGSI-LD context broker will forward me the data in that specific format. And also the attributes. Maybe I would like to receive only the filling and the controlled asset attributes of the entities and not all the other attributes of the entities. And I can specify which attributes I would like to receive. And that's all for the theoretical part. Now we will see the demo. But before of that, I don't know if you have questions.
Are there any questions? So my question is basically, you know, this way we can exchange data among processes. Is this correct?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And you are standard. If you well implement the NGSI-LD, you are standard and you are interoperable with existing systems that are able to talk NGSI-LD. And this is why NGSI-LD is very, very important.
Okay, very good. The next problem with Intema is to define our data description so that they are interoperable between various partners. But that's another story. Thank you.
Yes, Ioni. In thema description, what we need to specify is the entity we want to deal with in order to subscribe all the other technologies through the entity.
Let's discuss them later on.
Yeah.
And then sure. Thank you.
Okay, now let's see a short demo of NGSI-LD context broker. I try to exit here, and where is it? Stop share and share all my screen. Okay, hope that you are able to see my screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay, this is a simple Docker compose in order to have run Orion and MongoDB, because Orion, pay attention that all the things that we say during the theoretical presentation are valid for all the NGSI-LD context broker. Currently, we have 3 NGSI-LD context broker: Orion, Stelio, and Scorpio. In this case, in this demo, we are using Orion LD, but since all of these 3 NGSI-LD context broker are compliant with NGSI-LD, the API are the same, and also the data format. So you can use which context broker you would like to use. In this case, we will use Orion LD. So based on these, the image from Orion LD, from Fireware, and yeah, the ports is 1026. And we have also a MongoDB. But pay attention, this MongoDB doesn't have, hasn't the historical data of an entity. The MongoDB on Orion LD context broker will have data, for example, for the subscription, in order to keep track of the subscription, in order to keep track of the last value of the entities, but not for the historical data. For the historical data, you need to have an external component that is able to store the data from Orion LD context broker. This is very, very important. So MongoDB is to have stored the subscription, the entity type, the last value of the attributes, but not the historical data. So what I do here is Docker Compose Up. Simple to have up and running Orion and Mongo. So now we have an empty Orion LD without data in the MongoDB. And I created here some APIs that we can use in order to interact with this NGSI-LD context broker. First of all, the first API is the creation of an entity. And in order to create an entity, we can use this post request to the NGSI-LD. You see the base path that we see before, NGSI-LD version 1 entities. And here I have a JSON, but it's not a simple JSON, it's a JSON-LD. And why? Because we have the ID that is a URI, the type that is mandatory, in this case, water quality observed. And if I go down, we have also the context. Let's create this entity. Now we have created. But before to go on, let's see what happens if here I don't have any URI, but I have 1.3, for example. Send. You see here errors, because in NGSI-LD said, pay attention that ID is not a valid URI. And the same if I come back to the URI here for the type. If I delete the type and send the request, the type is missing. This is why we have an NGSI-LD context broker here. And the same for the context, of course. If I delete the context here, this is not an NGSI-LD, you see? The context must be present in the JSON payload, because the NGSI-LD context broker is able to talk JSON-LD, not simple JSON. So let's create another entity. You see, this is a different entity because the ID is different. Send. And this is created. And now let's query the entities. In this case, with this GET request, I would like to get the entities with type water quality observed and limit to. This is used to limit the result, the length of the result of the API. If I go send, you see here that I have both the entities that I created before. You see here? But if I specify here one, I have only one entity here. The one that I created before. This is how I can query the entities based on the type. Of course, if I change this type, let's say, for example, device, I get not found, of course, because I created two entities of water quality observed type. Then I can use also the query language. This is what we see during the presentation, the query language. In this case, I would like to get the entities that have the attribute temperature, and the attribute, the value of the attribute temperature is less than 15. If I send, I have the entities that I created before, because if I go on the temperature, you see that I have a temperature 24.4. If I get here greater than 15, I don't have entity, because the temperature is less than 30 in the entities that I created before. This is the query language, very, very powerful because you can filter the data and not to get all the data and filters yourself by using code, for example. I can get entities also by using ID. This is the API. In this case, I'm asking the Orion LD to get the entities, or better, the entity is one entity, because we can have a single entity ID. We cannot have multiple entity ID in the same tenant. So in this case, I'm asking to get this entity. And if I get, you see that I don't have an array here, but a single entity with the entity that I created before. And this is a GeoQuery entity. In this case, in this GeoQuery, I'm asking Orion LD Context Broker to get the entities that in which, sorry, there is the geometry location in which we have the geolocation with this type, and as values of this location, we have a point. You see here, geometry equal to point, and the point, the value of this point is near to this point. You see here, and in particular, the max distance on this point is this one. In this case, I'm able to get only the entities that are within a place, within a zone. If I send, you see here that I get the entities that I created before. Another important thing that I would like to talk is this one, options. I can get the entities in normalized. We talked before about the data format, and this is the normalized data format, you see, because we have type and value. But I can have also the entity in key values, for example. If I change it, you see here that I have key values. So we can choose which data format we would like to get from Orion LD Context Broker. If I change the max distance, of course, we don't have entities because the entities that I created before are not in this condition. Maybe the distance is more than 10. And this is another powerful feature of Orion LD Context Broker because we can filter based on GeoQuery on the entities. Finally, let's see the subscription. And maybe this is the most important feature, as I said before. In this case, I would like to create a subscription here. This is the URL to create a subscription, is a post request. I would like to subscribe on the entity type water quality observed. So I will be notified if an entity from water quality observed type will change. And when I will be notified? When this attribute, watched attribute, this one, is greater than 2. Which data I would like to receive? I would like to receive the temperature and also this other attribute in the format key values at this URL. This is a URL exposed by my application, my client. And Orion LD, when this condition happens, when someone updates these entities with the value greater than 2, I will receive a notification to this URL in key values format with this attribute. Let's see how it works. In order to do that, I need to expose an API. I will use this tool. This tool allows me to create easily an API, a mock server. Okay, now we have our API exposed, that is this one. I can copy and paste here, okay? In order to have be notified to that specific API when this condition happens. Let's create this subscription created. You see here that I don't receive anything right now because the entities was not updated until now. So let's come back to the Postman and let's use these other APIs. These other APIs is to update an attribute of a specific entity. You see, this is a patch request. And I would like to update the entities with this ID, and in particular, the attribute of this entity. And as payload, I put these parameters, and as value, this value. Notice that this value is greater than the condition. So when I update this entity, you see it was updated right now. I come back to my application, and I received the URL, the request. If I open this request, print here, you see that as body of this request, I get the data. And as data, I get the two attributes that I specified before, the temperature and pH. If I come back, where is it? The button maybe here? No, I lost maybe. No. If I update again one or more times, for example, this case or in this case, and again, you see here that I get, okay, now it asks me to register, but if you see on the background, you see that we received 3 notifications because I update the APIs, the entities 3 times. And that's how the subscription works. Do you have some question about these APIs?
Is there any question? Better continue, then there are questions at the end, possibly.
Okay, I think that the only thing that I would like to add, the final thing, is that we not talk about tenant here. You see here, we didn't pass any tenant. If you pass null as tenant, the Orion LD context broker will take the default tenant. But as I said, we can pass here NGSI-LD tenant and specify here a tenant value. For example, my tenant. Maybe this was this way. Okay, already exists, of course, because the ID is the same. If I change it, it creates to me these new entities on this tenant. And yes, that's all from my side.
Okay, thank you very much, Matteo. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, then we can proceed. Thank you very much again. Then we can proceed to